Neither of us have a traditional wine background or a farming background. So I was in the British Army for 10 years. I was in the Royal Engineers, and my wife is an academic. My last 4 years of service in the British Army, we were based in Kenya, in East Africa, and I left the army in I think 2018, and stayed in Kenya for another couple of years. And I worked for a US company, doing working in solar energy and electromobility in Western Kenya. And we suddenly realised, it was time to come home to the UK for a number of reasons. And we'd always talked about, we're going to plant a vineyard one day, when we retire. That romantic dream of retiring off into the sunset and that kind of easy viticulture life. And we found ourselves at a bit of a crossroads, and we thought, why not just do it now? So, in 2019, we sold our house, to fund the business in the UK, and got on a flight. We landed back in the UK in February 2020, straight into COVID, which was a bit of a shock for us, but worked out in the end. And planted in May 2020 and have gone from there, really.
Welcome, everybody, back to the Barrels and Roots podcast. I'm your host, Sean Trace, and I have an awesome guest with me today. Would you like to tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do?
Thanks, Sean. So my name is Martyn Pollock. I am the managing director and co-founder of Nine Oaks Vineyard. We're a small family-run vineyard based in Kent in England. And we grow champagne varieties and Bacchus, and we make still and traditional method sparkling wines.
That's awesome. How did you get started on this path? How did you dive in, and what was it that made you embark upon this journey?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is neither my wife. So it's my wife and I who run the business. Neither of us have a traditional wine background or a farming background. So I was in the British Army for 10 years. I was in the Royal Engineers, and my wife is an academic. My last 4 years of service in the British Army, we were based in Kenya, in East Africa, and I left the army in I think 2018, and stayed in Kenya for another couple of years. And I worked for a US company, doing working in solar energy and electromobility in Western Kenya. And we suddenly realised, it was time to come home to the UK for a number of reasons. And we'd always talked about, we're going to plant a vineyard one day, when we retire. That romantic dream of retiring off into the sunset and that kind of easy viticulture life. And we found ourselves at a bit of a crossroads, and we thought, why not just do it now? So, in 2019, we sold our house, to fund the business in the UK, and got on a flight. We landed back in the UK in February 2020, straight into COVID, which was a bit of a shock for us, but worked out in the end. And planted in May 2020 and have gone from there, really.
That's amazing. But it's so interesting too, because it's this journey, and was there a wine that first got you interested in wine, and what do you remember about that moment? Do you remember the vintage, or was it just something that was more gradual?
I think I'll be a little cheeky, and I'll talk about two wines that really influenced me. So the first one, going back, really one of the first wines I ever had. So going back to the late 90s. I'm obviously Scottish, I'm not English, which is a little bit strange for being in the English wine industry. I grew up in the west coast of Scotland, a place called Oban, a small kind of fishing town on the coast. And growing up, we lived in hotels. So, my parents weren't hugely well off, but, we were hoteliers. We'd kind of moved from small hotel to a small hotel, and we would live there. And my dad was a classically trained chef. So we'd always have like a seafood and a steak restaurant as part of the hotel. And I remember in the late 90s, my uncle coming to stay, and it was a bit of a family get together. I think I must have been about 16 at the time. And we sat down for dinner. I don't remember what we ate specifically, but knowing my dad, it would have been a sirloin steak with pepper sauce and cooked medium rare because that was always his thing. And he served some red wine. And at that point, I tried various different things. I'd had beers, kind of cider. I tried wine before, but it never really clicked in any way. And I have no idea the vintage, but it was a Chateauneuf de Pape that he served. And Chateauneuf de Pape served with sirloin steak. It was just kind of a match made in heaven, really. And I think for me, that was the first moment that I went, "Wow, it can be more than just, some fruity juice in a glass. It can actually enhance both, what you're eating, what you're drinking, but also the entire experience as well. The experience of being with other people, etc. So that was the kind of wine, I became it was by no means became a wine buff from that point on. I never have been really, but I've come back and back and back to Chateauneuf du Pape and that GSM blend. All throughout my kind of life really, and it was really the wine that set me off, I would say. And then the second wine, so I said that we lived in East Africa for several years. Um, East Africa is not known for wines in any way, and there's a few different producers around. There's one in Kenya. There's a few in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is bang on the equator. It's a strange place to grow grapes and to make wine. But there's a couple of producers, one in particular, Rift Valley Wines, and I remember working in northern Ethiopia in a place called Dira Dawa, and I bought a bottle of wine from a convenience store, and it was baking hot, like 40 degrees Celsius, not kept in the right way, etc. I think it was a Cab Sauv Merlot blend, and it's not a wine that would have won, competitions here or got a huge number of points, but it was a wine that really fitted in the moment. They've got really volcanic soils there, so it was a really like deep, rich red wine with a lot of character. And I think why it comes to mind really is it was fantastic in that moment in that place. And then I did take some bottles home to Kenya and some back to the UK, and it wasn't kind of the same experience either. So it was really interesting to just discover that a wine can be, it can be one thing in its own place and something else, in a completely different context as well.
That's interesting. It's something that's really I had this one, and I don't know what it was, uh, but it was an interesting wine that was just absolutely delicious in that moment. I had just finished doing something in the heat. It was hot, and it was this white, and it was chilled perfectly, and I was just like, "That is the most heavenly wine I've ever had." But I remember I went back to the same place a couple months later. Weather was different, got the same wine. I was just like, that's different. It just didn't hit the same way. And it was interesting too. And I said, "Is this the same vintage, the same bottle, the same?" And they're like, "This is the same everything, man." And I was like blown away because I didn't realize that your own situation and what's going on around you can change things as well, you know?
And it's the element of discovery, isn't it? I think there is fun in
Yeah.
just you know, not knowing what you're going to experience and not having that anticipation. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're like, wow, this really worked. And I think sometimes you can't take that magic away. You can't replicate that. You can't then go out, I'm going to have this every single day. And I think one thing for us that I find really interesting is that I taste my wines every week. We don't tend to open them, but there's always a tasting or there's, a trade tasting or something. So you always taste, check the wines, make sure everything's okay, etc. And you can see they change over time and they change in different scenarios. It's not a static thing. So I think it's kind of it's I think it's part of the mystery of wine for me, really. It's that, you're always trying to kind of catch that at its best, and it's not necessarily more time. It might be that moment or whatever, and it always comes when you least expect it, I would say.
That's a good point. It really does come when you least expect it. Like you're never thinking about like, "Oh, this is gonna be the thing that just tastes a and you're just like, "Wow, that was amazing." I've had that a couple times with different foods and different drinks and definitely different wines, but it's such a special experience when you get it. But I want I want to ask you this question. What is that one? Talk to me about what you got behind you, man.
Uh,
You referenced it.
this
What
is
do you got going on back there?
this is our Blanc de Blanc 2022. So yeah, it was the second sparkling wine we ever made. 100% Chardonnay, 3 years on lees. Yeah, it's you get a lot of citrus fruit, bone dry, and there's a touch of salinity in there as well. So yeah, one of our favorite ones. I just noticed it was on the mantelpiece behind there. We just got wine everywhere in our house. It's just like coming out there.
That's awesome. It's a good thing to have all over your
Yeah, it's
house.
kind of you keep
But
me
I want
over
to
all the
ask you,
time, but
like,
yeah.
what made you decide to plant grapes and start a vineyard in England?
Yeah, so I think it was, as I say, we had the life change, and we just didn't have those careers that were, that were walk back in a bowl in the UK. English wine was gaining in popularity, and it was really surging. Kind of late 20 teens, early 2020s, just before COVID. I mean, it still is, but it was particularly at that point. I think, for anyone who's not aware, the Romans were the first people to bring vines to the UK 2,000 years ago. And then it kind of dropped off for about 2,000 years. And it was the 1950s, people started planting more like German varieties and things like Savoy Blanc and Dornfelder, etc. And it was kind of quite a regional thing. You'd go to a vineyard, maybe taste some wines, you'd buy a couple of bottles, but it didn't really have a huge amount of traction. And then we have a brand called Nye Timber that was planted by an American actually in the 1990s. And like a lot of things in life, it just took a different set of eyes for someone to come and say, actually, we can put champagne varieties here. We're super close to champagne as it is anyway. And yeah, the Nye Timber effect. So since then, the last 30 years, it's really exploded, particularly with sparkling wine across the UK. So yeah, we'd had this plan that we were going to do it one day, and we just saw a kind of right moment, both within the market, a right moment in our own lives as well. And we already had a piece of land. My wife had a piece of land in Kent, which really is 90% of the battle to get right. So yeah, we thought we'll take the plunge now and go for it from there.
I love that, man. Sometimes you have to dive in. But, if someone who doesn't understand anything about wine asked you, what does a vineyard owner do all day? What would you tell them?
I think the first thing would be that I'd probably disappoint them. I think there's a lot of things that we do. It's like any small business; you end up doing pretty much everything.
Everything.
I would say somewhere between 60 and 70% of my day, and probably any brand's relevant day, it's sales, and it's got to be sales. I think we are at a stage at the moment in the UK where um, the concept of English wine is growing, it's growing exponentially. But getting the product to market and getting the brand out there and getting people drinking it and talking about it is the real hard work, really. So it's a lot of trade tastings. It's a lot of events, just getting in front of consumers. It's a lot of social media. It's a lot of going out and visiting, bars, restaurants, etc. And really just kind of anchoring yourself in the market. Um, the other 20%, I would say, or another 20% is definitely the viticultural side. So we try and stay very hands-on in the vineyards. We do get a little bit of help, but I do the majority of stuff myself. So both the labor side, and then I tend to do my tractoring at night. So put the kids to bed and then just get out in the tractor and do a spray or mow or weed or whatever it is that needs to be done at that time. And then I guess I'd say the last 10% is really building the business of the future. What are we going to do in 5 years, 10 years time? What's the market going to look like? And, and how do we innovate? So I think the easy answer is I definitely disappoint, because I think it's, people want to see it as, riding around a tractor and kind of, having a great time all the time. And there is an element of that, but it's, yeah, I'd say it's a small business through and through.
I I think that one of the things is that I think sometimes people don't know what to expect. Uh, I recently had someone on that was a cattle farmer, And I was like, "What do people think cattle farming do?" And she's like, "They literally think we're cowboys. Like, they think every day I'm, like, riding a horse going, 'Yee-haw!'" She's like, "They don't realize that, like, there's a lot of poop
Mhm.
shoveling. There's, like, a lot of poop shoveling. Like, you gotta clean a bunch of poop, and there's a lot of veterinary work." And she says, "People don't understand how much time is, like, spent around making sure that all the cows are not just well fed, but like," and she had a dairy farm, and she was like, "If we want to keep the milk at the best quality, we need healthy animals. You got to make sure that they're eating well and taking care of all these other things." And it's wild because people just don't
Mm.
know. They literally don't know. And they assume, and when we assume, it goes to wild and crazy areas, of our brains that we kind of make up the facts, but it's often
Yeah,
not
definitely.
right. But I wanted to ask you this because as someone's doing it, what is the hardest part of growing grapes that most wine drinkers never
I
see?
think I think the weather is definitely one of the biggest challenges that we have. Especially we're an emerging industry. We planted our vineyards from first principles, as a lot of vineyards have been in the UK. And therefore, it's really crucial to get a good crop every year, and make sure you're kind of building up stocks, and in a marginal climate, in what we are, it's not been very long since England was considered not growable in terms of the latitudes. We do get a lot of poor weather. 2024, we lost most of our crop, almost all of it. And actually, it probably would have been better if we had lost all of it. It was just a wet and rainy summer. It started raining in January and didn't really finish till December. It was just a complete washout, and we had a lot of downy and powdery mildew in the vineyard. And I think it's easy to assume that it's all sunshine and everything's going well, and the bad years they don't come, or when they do, there's a big insurance policy that pays out or something. But the reality is that it's too inconsistent to have those insurance policies in place. We don't have the government support that we might have in a traditional wine growing country, where it is we're still seen as, I wouldn't say a sideshow, but we're still quite a small part of farming in the UK. And it's definitely not seen as, I think in France the government will and does step in when there are big shocks, because it is such an important part for the entire economy of the country, whereas we're not quite there yet. So I think the weather is definitely the biggest part that I think people might not fully realize just the impact that it can have, and how big a risk factor it is. I mean, I was a consultant for many years after we planted. I worked in the city of London for 4 years while we established. And actually, you talk about managing risk. How are we going to eliminate this risk? How are we going to control this risk? And then you come into the farm, and it's, well, we can't do any of those things. And there isn't the money to say, as I say, put all the insurances in place to make sure that it doesn't affect you.
It's so interesting because whether, I one of the things that I just think about with England is that the amount of rain and not a lot of sunshine. Is that what is the biggest challenge with weather? You recently battled frost in the vineyard. How stressful is it knowing that one night of weather can affect an entire year of work? Is frost the biggest danger, or is it other things? What is the
Yeah,
biggest weather challenge that you
I think
have?
so we're in a sixth vintage now, and every single year has been completely different. So we've had the wettest year on record, the hottest year, the driest year. We kind of felt that frost was coming this year, so we did put some measures in, and I think we lost somewhere between 5 and 10% of crop, which, considering we had the conditions for quite a big crop year this year. So I think we we've been quite lucky, and I know vineyards close by and across the country, some that have lost almost everything or everything. Um, so frost it is really a big factor, but it's probably one of the factors that you can control a little bit more. So you can have frost candles. There's frost dragons and things that you can put into the vineyard that blow smoke and hot air around, etc., and prevent frost taking place. So I think frost is quite stressful, and it is a stressful time, those 2 months, April and May, when you are just watching the weather, every single day it drives you insane to go, and it makes you realize how generic the weather is as well. It might be rainy, it might not be, and it's kind of so you kind of go a little bit crazy sometimes. And it is quite lonesome when you're out there at 3 o'clock in the morning lighting candles by yourself and, kind of moving around. And it's, but I think it's probably the factor that is more controllable. And the ones that aren't are, downy and powdery mildew. If it decides to rain for 3 months, it's going to rain for 3 months. And there's a lot of things you can do, but once those, in particular, those diseases take hold, it is very difficult to control.
Yes, I can only imagine. Now, I wanted to ask you this, like, um, but I was reading, I was like looking at this up, and I was like, um, because I was like, English wine, I just didn't think of England as a wine growing region, but it's getting attention right now. Why is that?
I think there's a little bit of climate change, so things have got warmer. So there's more people are planted. Sparkling wine has, as I say, from the '90s, has really been, banging on the door of Champagne, and we're very close to Champagne. Where we sit on the same seam of chalk. We're less than 100 miles, etc., away from Champagne. From a still perspective, we've been getting better and better at making still wines, particularly with traditional varieties like Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, etc. And I think it's really starting to have a bit of a bow wave behind it. When we first started 6 years ago, lots of people would, have preconceptions about English wine, and they might think it's not very good, or it's obscure varieties, etc. Whereas we're seeing it more and more that, um, particularly in the UK, the public's sentiment towards English wine has been, really, really strong and really powerful. I think people do want to have locally made products. They want to reduce food miles, and they want to engage with wine. I think. They want to engage with winemakers, and actually, they can. From London, we're less than 60 minutes on the train, so you can be in the city in the morning, go and have a wine tasting in the afternoon, being back in the city in the evening, and you just can't do that with an Argentinian Malbec or an Australian Shiraz or something. It's just, and I think we've not had that before, and we're a big wine drinking nation, so I think it is really powerful that the consumer can engage in that way.
That's awesome. I want to ask you this next question because I'm just beyond curious. Like, building a vineyard is one thing, but building a wine brand is another. What have you learned about creating a brand that people actually connect with, you know?
It's a really interesting question, 'cause I think, a lot of people do, they plant the vines, and, and that's a really exciting thing. You plant the vineyard and you go, "Wow, this is great." And then you get kind of sucked into working in the vineyard, and then it comes to, you've got to make wine now. So, and in the UK, most of us work through contract wineries, in the beginning, at least. So you get your wine made, and then actually the sales and marketing piece, is it's a really tough market. English wine is generally more expensive than wines from other nations, just because of the scale that we're on, and also the capital inputs that we've had to put in at this stage. Um, so yeah, it's a real uphill struggle. So I think a lot of people, when they get to that point where they've got a product to sell, um, underestimate, the value of brand building, and how long it takes, and how difficult it can be. I think it's really important to, I'd say, market, not necessarily, firing out adverts and magazines and social media and things, but having a really consistent drumbeat on social media, or communication of, what you're doing as a brand, more than kind of who you are, if that makes sense, in terms of, where you see your wines, and, and where you're trying to, we try a lot to get out of the vineyards and get our wines in interesting places, not necessarily restaurants or anything, but just, landmarks, places. Um, and really try and tell as much of the story of, why we got into this, um, to really develop that brand awareness. And it takes a lot of time, and a lot of it is you're putting effort in, and it feels like you're not getting anything back, but you actually are. It's like they say there's 7 touch points in marketing before a person makes a decision, and it's not necessarily all about sales. It's about building awareness, getting people invested in what you do, and then hopefully, building a customer base that will come back and back and back. They may buy a bottle one day and then can come for a vineyard tour, and then come to a supper club or something, or and kind of keep that awareness, going for the long term.
That's really interesting. I wanted to ask you this too, because the wine industry is changing rapidly. What opportunities and challenges do you see smaller producers having to deal with over the next decade?
Yeah, no, I think, Sean, that's a really good question because I think globally, consumption is definitely down. I think, and there's a lot of people that are really concerned about that. There's a lot of voices around the world, from kind of Australia to the US to Europe that are saying, the younger generation are drinking less. They're drinking less than their parents did. They're going out less, and that being a really big problem. And I think for mass market brands, that definitely would be an issue, and there needs to be some kind of resetting and recalibration. And that's got to be really hard for some of the bigger producing countries that maybe have to pull up their buyings or whatever. But I think going forwards, we just have to really be aware that the consumer is definitely asking the question why. Why should I drink a wine? And I think the old message of, well, it's from this appellation and we've been doing this for 500 years doesn't necessarily land anymore. I think the kind of story behind it, and it needs to be a genuine story as well of, well, I did this because I wanted to get into wine, and a lot of the storytelling around, how difficult things are, and I think that always lands a lot better in terms of, getting the message across, that it's a genuine thing rather than, kind of sunsets and smiles, because communicating some of the message for when things don't go to plan and that you don't get a crop or that you get, because these are just the realities of farming. It's not anything unique to viticulture. Um, so I think there are definitely opportunities for smaller brands, and the use of social media to communicate that message, and really build that brand following. Because I think we do have to be aware that we are competing against a really congested market. It's we're competing against tequilas, gins, beers, ciders, and as I say, the consumer really is saying, "Well, why? Why do I need to drink wine?" And I think um, it's not a insurmountable mountain to climb, but we just have to make sure that we maintain relevance in the marketplace and that we tell that story and that we adapt as well. I think one criticism I would have is that I think we have become quite firm in what wines are, what good wines are, what bad wines are, and how winemaking should be. And I mean globally as an industry. And I think actually, if we take wine as an art form, it's a bit like food, it's about like music. There might be great food and music from the past, but it doesn't mean that, the young kids, the young generation are going to be into the Beatles or, want to eat melon and Parma ham. I think, we have to adapt. And, I think, orange wines are a really interesting place for that, where, this is something that's relative, it's obviously old in wine terms, but relatively new in terms of mass market, natural wine movement, and people really just pushing the boundaries and asking the questions of, well, why can't we do this and why can't we do that? And, not getting into the gimmick space, but trying to do things differently, and keep things as fresh as possible, really.
I think that's so good. I want to ask you a different question now. If you were to pour two glasses, one for me and one for you, one for a little bit fun for both of us, what are you pouring right now?
From my own wines,
Yeah,
yeah,
of course, of your own
yeah.
wines. Let's go with that.
So if I was going to pour one for you, so we got a brand new wine out that we just released the last couple of months. It's a Rosa Orange, so it's a blend of skin contact Bacchus. We had the Bacchus on skins for 28 days. If anyone's not aware of Bacchus, it's a German Great variety, but it works really, really well in the UK. And then we blended that with Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, Rosé, and just a touch of Chardonnay as well. So the idea was we were trying to get the structure and the texture of the orange, and then the delicacy and the finesse of the rosé. So it's something fun. It's something a little bit different. And really I hope speaks to a little bit of that kind of questioning of why, what's the relevance and and where it should go. And I think the feedback we've had from consumers so far has been really positive on the whole. Some people it's not for them, and I think another thing that wine has to get really used to is that it's all subjective, and there will be other people out there that say I don't like that, and that's totally fine. That's okay. Um, and for myself, I would probably pour our Chardonnay. So, Chardonnay gets a really bad rep in the UK. It's funny. I think for a long time, in the 90s, early 2000s, we were flooded with kind of Australian and Californian Chardonnays that were heavily oaked, and it was a little bit too much for the consumer. So I think a lot of people have moved away from Chardonnay, but we're trying to make a lighter style. So we do 50-50 stainless steel and French oak, and then we use all old oak as well. So the idea is we want to get fruit character on the wine as well as the oak flavor. So, you get fruit first, I actually get a little break, and then you get cedar and vanilla on the finish. And I think that style has become much more popular in the UK, along with completely unoaked versions as well. So I think it's it's a really fun wine. It's developed in the bottle a lot over the last 2 years, but it's still really interesting because when I meet, if I'm doing a tasting and I meet Europeans or North Americans or Australians, South Africans, they all gravitate towards Chardonnay because it's such a great grape variety. But in the UK, despite being such a big wine nation, we still have an ABC movement and anything but Chardonnay movement, which is a real shame.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I want to ask you one last question. When someone opens a bottle of Nine Oaks, what do you hope they're experiencing besides what's in that class?
That's a good question. I think I kind of take it from two perspectives. So, firstly, the character of each vintage. Really, we don't blend our wines away or anything like that. Everything is a vintage, sparkling, and still, and we try and reflect that. I think when people ask about a wine, I immediately go back to that time. Whether it was a baking hot summer in 2022, a really rainy summer in 23, or the wettest, coldest summer we've ever had in 2024. I think there's always interest between those. And I think it's also really important to say that it's often misunderstood that, a really good summer makes a great wine. That's sometimes the case, but it's much more nuanced. You can have kind of good ripening period, even in a really bad summer that makes, what was on paper, a terrible year or a more challenging year, can actually still make some really interesting wines. And then I think the second thing I would say is definitely a lot of our marketing and comms. We do direct. It's about just marketplaces, food and drink festivals, getting out and seeing consumers. So I think that personal connection. So I do think wine, and particularly wine going forward, will be much more than just the liquid in the bottle. It is the engagement that you had, the experience that you had, whether you came to the vineyard or you met someone from the vineyard, that gave you, not necessarily the story because it's a little bit can be a little bit cliched, but you know, um, that introduced you to that wine, and you know, gave you the why of why we're trying to do what we're doing or why we made those specific decisions within that wine, etc.
Where can people go to find out more about you and what you do?
So they can find us at our website, 9-oaks.co.uk. And then we distribute in the UK through Davies Wine Merchants in London and Page and Sons Wine Merchants in Kent, or they can contact us direct.